This is the PowerPoint for Chapter 4, Recurring Victimization. So today we're going to talk about recurring victimization, or victimization that happens more than once to the same person or same place. So being victimized once increases the likelihood that you will be victimized again. So those that have been victimized in the past are more likely than those who have not been victimized in the past to be victimized in the future. So there's several different types of recurring victimization. Recurring victimization is kind of the, umbrella term. And this covers when a person or place is victimized more than one time. And this counts for any types of victimization. So, for example, a man is assaulted by a friend and then their truck gets stolen the year after. This would be considered recurring victimization. And we also want to talk a little bit about the term re-victimization. So this is when a person is victimized more than once by any type of victimization, but across a relatively wide span of time. So generally, we talk about re-victimization being in different developmental periods, if this is a person we're talking about. So maybe they were victimized, sexually assaulted as a child, and then raped again when they're in college. This is considered a re-victimization. So repeat victimization happens when a person or place is victimized more than once than the same type of victimization. And this happens in a relatively short time span. So the time period varies depending on, the study being completed, but the National Crime Victimization Survey uses a period of 1 year for repeat victimization. So for example, if a young woman is assaulted by her boyfriend in June and then again in July, this would count as a repeat victimization. And we can just see here in the little table, this is from the NCVS, and you can tell that a lot of people, the months between first and second victimization among repeat crime victimizations, it happens pretty fast. So usually less than 1 month being victimized, if you're going to be re-victimized, you're going to be victimized quite soon after the initial victimization. The next type of recurring victimization we're going to be talking about is polyvictimization. And this is experiencing the victim of multiple crimes by multiple actors. And usually when we're talking about polyvictimization, we're talking about childhood victimization. So childhood abuse, we're going to get into that in a later chapter, but we have different domains, so physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, bullying, and polyvictimization would be a child that experiences more than one of these. So maybe they'll experience physical abuse by their caregivers, neglect, and then bullying at school. That would be a polyvictim. So these kids suffer the most serious types of victimization, and they're also more likely to have other adversities, such as illness, family unemployment, mental illness, suffer accidents, and have parents that abuse substances or parents that are justice involved. Okay, so near repeat victimization is when there's a place that's victimized that is in close proximity to a place that was previously victimized. So usually we're not talking about individuals here, we're talking about places, and this would usually be property crimes. So this is studied a lot of the time with burglaries. So you might notice that there seems to be multiple houses on the same street that all kind of get burgled. So this might be because the burglar decides that, hey, this house was easy to break into. I'm going to go back to this neighborhood because, I got away with it the first time. I'm probably going to be able to do it again. So you'll notice that burglaries tend to kind of happen in little clumps in geographical areas. They all tend to be sort of close together. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the extent of recurring victimization. So a small percentage of victims account for large amounts of re-victimization experiences during to recurring victimization. So those people and those places that have experienced victimization are the ones that are going to going to be experiencing it again and again and again and again. So for example, only between 2 and 18% of victims experience 60 to 90% of violent crime experiences. So there's a very small number of people experiencing a large number of violent crime. So victims, while they can be victim of, a different type of crime, so maybe someone is assaulted and then gets their truck broken into, they're more likely to be victim of the same crime. So experiencing, for example, intimate partner violence again and again and again. Of course, rates of recurring victimization, they do vary according to measurement and according to crime type. Here are a few different, surveys of victimization surveys. So the NCVS, here in America, 21% of people said that they were repeat victims. In England and Wales, 23% said they're repeat victims. And a survey done in Canada, the Canadian version of the NCVS, found that 38% of people were repeat victims. So there's certain crimes that are much more likely to have recurrent victimization, and these are intimate partner violence, rape, assault, and property victimization as well. So for time periods, you're most at risk for being victimized immediately after your initial victimization, and your risk kind of declines with time. So if you experience some intimate partner violence, you're very likely to experience it again very soon after, rather than, for example, several years down the road. Okay, so a little bit about intimate partner violence. So the National Violence Against Women study found that women experience an average of 2.9 rapes a year. So there's a few women that experience a large number of rapes. Women who are victims of IPV were victimized by an average of 6.9 times a year by partner. Again, IPV is one of those crimes that has a very, very high rate of recurring victimization. So those that have been victim of intimate partner violence are likely to experience it again and again. They found that women who experienced childhood sexual abuse were 6 times more likely to be victim of a sex crime by her partner as an adult than women who did not experience any childhood sexual abuse. Okay, and here is a little case study or example of recurring victimization or repeat victimization. Christy Mack, she was in the news a few years ago for the horrific victimization experience that she had. She suffered repeat intimate partner violence again and again and again by her on-again, off-again boyfriend, but for reasons that we've talked about, she didn't report it to police. So she finally was able to leave her toxic relationship, and her ex broke into her house and beat her and her male friend for hours and hours. She was, near death, very, very, very serious injuries, and she was managed to leave the house and go to a neighbor's house who then called 911. So she did experience a lot of victim blaming after the attack, especially for her profession. She's was a porn actress. But this goes to show those who experience IPV often are the ones that experience again and again and again. And if they do not report it, it's probably going to keep continuing. Okay, again, recurrent victimizations often happen shortly after the initial one. In most cases, it's 1 month or less. So burglary studies have found that about an average of 1 week between one burglary and the next burglary was common, an average of 1 week, so very, very soon right after. For residential burglaries, that includes burglaries of businesses as well. And for residential burglaries, near repeats tend to occur within 2 weeks. So again, near repeats is an address very close to the address that was previously victimized. So it happens really, really soon. These sort of areas are maybe seen as easy targets by people wanting to break into these houses and businesses, and it happens very, very soon after. Again, they're not random, they're concentrated in particular areas within a city or neighborhood. Okay, so the time course of recurrent victimization, it really is different depending on crime type. So here are just a few studies that have been done and some statistics about what has been found. So something like bank robbery, not as, the time period is a little bit longer for repeat victimization or recurrent victimization. So 33% of banks that were robbed again within 3 months. Domestic violence, 15% within 24 hours. So this is like a very sort of short time period for recurring victimization. Okay, so our risk factors for recurrent victimization are really similar to risk factors for victimization as a whole. So we have demographic characteristics that we talked about in chapter 3, I believe. So males more likely to experience all types of victimization except for sexual victimization. Those who are young, those who are single, separated, or divorced, those who have low socioeconomic status. This is particularly for personal crime. Interestingly enough, high socioeconomic status for property crime. So those that have a lot tend to be robbed more. Those who are unemployed. And why these factors? Well, if we think about chapter 3, how we talked about our theories of crime and the risky lifestyles and routine activities, these factors fit in here. These are the demographics that are more likely to be involved in a risky lifestyle, doing risky things with risky people. Again, spending time away from home at night, using public transport, hanging out with delinquent peers, engaging in delinquent or dangerous behavior, alcohol use. And these are all, again, go with the routine activities and risky lifestyles. Engaging in a risky lifestyle will make you more likely to experience victimization. Also, those that have PTSD, it might inhibit the ability to recognize these risky situations, and also if they have maybe any cognitive difficulties, mental health issues, they just might not recognize that they are in these risky situations. And there's genetic factors that go along with that as well. So it's been found that there's the 7 repeat allele of the DRD4 gene are more likely to experience recurring victimization, maybe because they just cannot recognize that they are putting themselves at risk to be victimized. Okay, and then we also have neighborhood or household level factors as well. And this is more so property crime, so being burglarized, having your truck stolen, having your truck broken into, etc. Those that live in dangerous neighborhoods, again, if you're around risky people, these people are likely to victimize you. There's more motivated offenders that are around these dangerous neighborhoods. Urban neighborhoods generally have more crime. Neighborhoods with a high number of single-parent households, this means that there's probably not anyone home during the day. If there's one single parent working, they're probably out of the house a lot of the time working to support their family. And we know that houses are more likely to be burglarized when nobody's at home. Neighborhood disorder, again, low and capable guardianship. Maybe there's these neighborhoods that maybe the police don't even want to be in because they're sort of dangerous. And then low-income household as well. But like I said, high income for property crime. Those households that have children actually more likely to be burglarized than those that do not. Those that have multiple cars parked outside, again, they're just suitable targets. Those that have 2 or more adults in the home. And if you lived in your household for a shorter amount of time, you're more likely to experience repeat victimization. This is specifically for burglaries. If you rent your house instead of owning. And these are all risk factors for victimization, burglary victimization in general, but specifically, again, for recurrent victimization. So there's a couple different theories that we can use to explain why some people are more likely to experience recurring victimization than others. The first one is risk heterogeneity explanation, or we call this FLAG. So recurring victimization occurs because of the quality or character of a victim. So it's just something about the victim that makes them more likely to experience recurring victimization. So this goes along with being a vulnerable target. So at no fault of the victim at all, we're not victim blaming or anything, but maybe they're, of low socioeconomic status and can't afford a car, has to walk home at night. Well, just the fact that they have to walk home instead of, driving home makes them more vulnerable. So some people are not able to change this, obviously, and then this makes the individual at more risk for subsequent victimization. So another theoretical explanation is the state dependence explanation, or BOOST. So this depends on how the sort of victimization event happens, or how the crime happens. How the victim and the offender both act during and after the victimization will determine if it occurs again. So a victim who uses self-defense is less likely than those who do not to be victimized again. So if someone is maybe experienced an act of intimate partner violence and fights back, maybe they're less likely to experience that again. Those with low self-control have also been found to be less likely to change their risky behaviors. So those that are sort of impulsive and maybe don't, think about the consequences before doing stuff tend to not change their risky lifestyles. Whereas people with high levels of self-control, if they've been victimized once, they might, figure out a way how to make it less likely that they'll be victimized again. Okay, so compounding vulnerability. So those with the most risk for victimization can signal that they're vulnerable for future victimization. So those that have a lot of risks and don't, whether they cannot change these risks or they just, don't recognize these risks, they'll kind of signal that they're going to be a vulnerable target and be victimized again and again. So victim salience happens when someone's risk is low prior to victimization, but the information offender gains from the crime will increase the risk for future victimization. So maybe someone, has a low risk of crime, maybe it's like an older couple that, live in a house or apartment or something, and they just don't lock their door. They get burglarized once. The burglar sees that, okay, they have a lot of cash sitting around, I steal it. And then the information that they gain from that crime makes it so that they're probably going to go back and victimize this address again. So negative state dependence happens when your victimization risk would decrease because the victim would learn how to decrease their risk. So, for example, if this burglar is breaking into this old couple's house, they do it once, get a bunch of cash and jewelry or whatever, and then the couple decides to lock their doors, get a guard dog, get a Ring doorbell, just things that, would protect their home a little bit more. They would be less likely to be victimized again because they, they protected themselves and changed their risk for being victimized. Okay, so some consequences for recurring victimization. So we don't really know whether those who suffer repeat victimization are more likely to experience negative psychological consequences. So we don't know if it's really that first time that sort of sets the stage, or if it's compounding and things kind of get worse and worse the more victimization experiences you or one experiences. So it has been found that the number of sexual assaults experienced during a woman's lifetime was predictive of current depressive symptoms, current PTSD symptoms, poor health, and binge drinking. So here it did matter how many times during the study of how many sexual assaults happened. The more sexual assaults, the worse the consequences were. Again, some studies found that, subsequent victimization wasn't really important. It was just, that first victimization event, and this is why these negative consequences came about. Okay, so polyvictims, we talked about polyvictims are usually children that experience more than one type of victimization. So maybe they experience physical abuse and neglect at the same time. So they're more likely to be distressed than victims of only one type of crime. So those with multiple sexual assaults do not show as many trauma symptoms as those who experience polyvictimization. So if you're just a victim of sexual assault, you might have worse outcomes if you have been a victim of, say, sexual assault and of, physical assault plus neglect. So those that are at risk for being polyvictims, and this is specifically for childhood, those who come from violent families, families with economic and substance abuse problems, living in a dangerous neighborhood, and having pre-existing emotional problems. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about some responses of recurrent victimization. So there's been a couple studies done. One study was done in England, and they found that those victims of crime that were provided with funds to secure their homes a little bit more, so changing the locks, adding security lighting, ring doorbells, etc., were less likely to be experience repeat victimization. But the same sort of study was done in the States, and there really wasn't any difference in those that suffered repeat victimization for burglary victims. One of the reasons for this is that the study in England gave financial funding to those victims to help secure their home, whereas in the United States, finances weren't provided and they just sort of told them how to better secure their home. So that probably has, a lot to do with why the England study was more successful. So one thing that is useful in preventing burglaries is target hardening. And we've talked about this a little bit already. So it makes it more difficult to offend. So it increases the guardianship if we want to think back to when we talked about routine activity theory. So again, putting up security cameras, locks, getting a big dog, better lighting, etc., is going to make it more likely that a burglar is not going to, the juice ain't worth the squeeze. They're not going to want to, go against a big dog if they don't know that they're going to get something good out of it. So a meta-analysis means sort of an average effect among all the studies that have been done on a topic, found that there's a 60% decrease in repeat victimization for those that incorporated target hardening than those that did not. So if you've been burglarized, that's a great way to not get burglarized again, is to increase the guardianship and harden your home. Okay, so sexual victimization responses have mostly been done to sort of teach victims on how to prevent future sexual assault. So these risk recognition programs, they do increase the likelihood of victim reducing their subsequent sexual victimizations, often administered on college campuses, and make women more knowledgeable about sexual assaults. Not, very good results for this, probably because they didn't, go after the root causes of violence and the offenders. They, taught their victims about sexual assault. So they haven't been found to be very positive results at all. So intimate partner violence victimization, most programs focus on the offenders rather than the victims, again. And this might include arresting the offender, anger management, and domestic violence. So what about the victim? So there's these second responder programs where a police officer and victim advocate will revisit an intimate partner violence victim to provide her or him with information on social and legal programs to assist her or him. But they haven't really shown to have a reduction in subsequent victimizations. So maybe it is that, we really have to go after the root causes of violence and sort of change the offender's motivation rather than just assisting the victim in order to prevent recurrent victimization.